Let's talk about why fresh seafood is a lie. When it gets warm, thousands of people flock to the coastlines and beaches, and in between getting sunburns and pina coladas, they enjoy some of the freshest seafood that this country has to offer. Because everyone knows the closer you are to the beach, the fresher the fish. Except, that's not always true. If I asked you, where would you go to get the freshest seafood? You'd probably say Florida, or Hawaii, or maybe San Francisco, and you'd probably imagine buying it from someplace that looks like this, displayed on ice at your local fish market. But there's one thing you'd probably never say. Frozen. It's the only bad word among many fishmongers. The common knowledge is that fish is either fresh or it's frozen, and therefore frozen fish can't be fresh. And in this $3 billion seafood industry, words like fresh and frozen matter to consumers. Fish markets and grocers even market that their goods are never frozen. Which is why so many of us are fixated on buying seafood behind a refrigerated glass display that's ready to be cooked, because we're told it's fresher and often healthier for us. Well, I'm here to tell you that we've all been lied to, and the freshest seafood you can buy is probably frozen. But before I get into that, let me back up a bit. I grew up on the Florida beaches and did a lot of fishing. My dad would clean them, my mom would cook them for dinner, and that was as fresh as you could get. But we always wondered why, when we went around to the local seafood restaurants around town, why the fish was never that good. These seafood places were popular with the local tourists, but they weren't all that fresh. Why was that? There's this general misconception that being simply closer to the ocean means fresher fish. Sitting in a beachside villa, it's nice to imagine that what's on your plate was reeled in by a local fisherman earlier that morning. But this romantic notion of fish is often not true. Let's talk about where seafood actually comes from. In the United States, we import most of our seafood from other parts of the world. That number is estimated to be at or around 70%, and potentially as high as 90%, although that's likely due to the fact that much of the seafood that is caught or produced here is actually sent overseas to factories where it's processed and then re-imported, which can skew the data a bit. Seafood is generally sourced in one of three ways: by farming, by trip boat, meaning multiple days at sea like in commercial fishing, or by day boat, which is done on a smaller scale and usually by a local fisherman, and that means going out for a day and coming back at the end of the day. Which brings me to my next point. Most seafood, at some point, is frozen. This is just a logistical necessity. Most commercial trip boats have to freeze their catch because they're out at sea for long periods of time, and most farmed fish is also frozen so that it can be transported to processing facilities, which can take days because it's often sent overseas. However, there is very much a market for fresh fish that is actually never frozen. Farms and day boats often select their premium stock, the best of the best fish, and sell it either wholesale at market or directly to customers fresh. This is fish that is usually kept on ice or refrigerated during transport and sale. Restaurants and fish markets actually pay a premium for this fresh fish because it is both high value and it is expensive to keep fish fresh. Fish spoils quickly and can go bad within just a few days if it's refrigerated or on ice. So fresh seafood buyers need to source and sell their product quickly so that it remains fresh. There's not a whole lot of room for error in this. But the vast majority of fresh fish that's put on ice display at your local grocer or in a chilled plastic container at your local Costco has actually been frozen. They just simply thought and put it on display so it looks fresh and more appealing. And the reason they do this has a lot to do with people's perceptions about frozen fish and marketing. See, people don't like the idea of frozen fish. It has negative connotations, mainly dating back before really the 1980s, when frozen fish resulted in a soggy, inferior product. Now this all changed with flash freezing. There's your typical freezer fish. You take something and you just stick it in your freezer. And this is done generally around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and because your regular freezer can't get much below 0, it usually takes hours to freeze. This causes large ice crystals to form, which break the cell membranes of the meat and result in water and nutrient loss once the fish is thawed. Then there's flash freezing, or blast freezing. Blast freezers can get below -100 degrees Fahrenheit and can freeze fish solid in a matter of just a couple minutes. These freezers are what commercial fishermen and fish farms use to lock in the freshness. The ice crystals are much smaller, so when the fish is thawed, it returns to its pre-frozen state of freshness. Here's a fun fact. Most wild-caught sushi in the US comes from frozen fish. That's actually because the government recommends flash freezing fish that's eaten raw because it kills parasites. So wait, is frozen fish actually fresher than fresh fish? In many cases, yes, but that also depends on where you get your seafood. Fish that is flash frozen right after it's harvested will remain fresh for months, as long as it's kept frozen. When it's thawed, it'll have the same limited few days of shelf life like a fresh fish before it spoils. But fish that's kept fresh has a much tighter window before it goes bad. If you count a day at sea and a day making its way through wholesalers and a day or two being transported, and that can be 3 to 5 days before it even makes its way to the shelf before a customer buys it. That's also why it's more expensive oftentimes at market. You're paying a premium to ensure the freshness of your product. But there is some truth to the myth that frozen fish is worse. And that's that raw fish purchased at the grocery store or fish market really shouldn't be frozen. The exception to that rule is that if you have a blast freezer or if you use dry ice at home to quickly flash freeze your fish. So to quickly recap, most seafood in the US doesn't come from the US. That doesn't matter if it's a restaurant in the middle of Nebraska or a beach in Florida. Most places get their seafood frozen. And flash frozen is actually just as good or perhaps a little bit fresher than fresh seafood. There was actually a study done at OSU where frozen fish was rated as good or better than fresh fish. There are many exceptions to this rule though. Many coastal seafood shacks and high-end Michelin star restaurants do serve fish that is caught earlier that morning, perhaps not far off from where it's served by the chef. And there are fish markets that do have some of the freshest fish you can buy, and I actually know one in Omaha, Nebraska, shameless plug, because they have unique relationships with wholesalers or with fishermen, and they're able to get their seafood immediately after it's caught. Now excuse me while I prepare this piece of wild-caught salmon that I bought frozen from Costco that was flash frozen right after it was caught, and then frozen for me to enjoy thawed at home to preserve its freshness. Thanks for watching.